Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of my deep dive into Project 2025. In the last video I covered Section 1 and part of Section 2. This part will cover Chapter 5 and the rest of Section 2. So let's get into it. Chapter 5 is titled Department of Homeland Security. The first and primary recommendation for the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, is the combination of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, the Department of Justice's Executive Office for Immigration Review, and the Office of Immigration Litigation into a standalone border and immigration agency at the cabinet level. Other recommendations include moving the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, to the Department of Transportation. It recommends FEMA be moved to the Department of the Interior, and if combined with CISA, to the Department of Transportation. The Coast Guard would be moved to the Department of Justice, but in times of full-scale war to the Department of DoD. Alternatively, they suggest it be moved to the DoD for all purposes. The U.S. Secret Service would be divided into two, with the protective element falling under Department of Justice and the financial enforcement element falling under the Department of Treasury. It also calls for the TSA to be privatized, and finally, the Science and Technology Directorate be moved to DoD, and the Office of Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction be moved to the FBI. The preface of this chapter closes with a suggestion that all remaining supporting components in DHS be dismantled. The next part of the chapter details the mission statement and a brief history of DHS. It then presents bullet points. It states, a successful DHS would 1. Secure and control the border. 2. Thoroughly enforce immigration laws. 3. Correctly and efficiently adjudicate immigration benefit applications while rejecting fraudulent claims. 4. Secure the cyber domain and collaborate with critical infrastructure sectors to maintain their security. 5. Provide states and localities with a limited federal emergency response and preparedness. 6. Secure our coasts and economic zones. 7. Protect political leaders, their families, and visiting heads of state or government. And 7. Oversee transportation security. The next section of this chapter details the Office of the Secretary and essentially only seeks to call for the Secretary to be more stringent in the application of current immigration and homeland security taskings, while also calling for the closure of unnecessary offices within DHS. It states these locations to be closed are, quote, to be determined. The next section covers Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. This section details, in the event that all immigrations agencies are not merged, that the consolidation of CBP and ICE is needed to form the new Border Security and Immigration Agency, or BSIA. The idea is that this would streamline all border and immigration security matters and eliminate excess overlap. This would also bring the combined organization under the U.S. National Security and Intelligence Community. It also calls for the publishing of border security data readily available to the public without needing White House or DHS review and approval, furthering transparency. It would also bring the Office of Air and Marine, or OAM, under the BSIA to utilize air and marine assets in the furtherance of their overall mission. Under this new directive, it also gives CBP, ICE, and USCIS authority to issue notices to appear, or NTA, to removable aliens in their presence, beginning removal proceedings, but with the caveat that preferably CBP turn over illegal aliens to ICE custody, who would then issue the NTA, and that authority being only reserved for limited purposes such as humanitarian reasons and medical emergencies. The proposal also requests increasing the funding for hiring Border Patrol to employ additional support personnel in order to relieve uniformed agents from administrative duties and return to a more focused law enforcement capacity. The next section covers Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. This section detailing reforms needed for ICE essentially begins by asking for ICE to be restricted from closing out pending immigration cases and apply the Immigration and Nationality Act as written by Congress. Essentially, this act aims to eliminate racial discrimination based on national origin. Another reform directs ICE to stop ignoring illegal aliens through the 287G program, which is essentially the stopgap between local law enforcement detention and notification to ICE removal operations. Basically, once an in custody is in the country illegally is scheduled for release from local jurisdiction, it requires notification to ICE for transfer of custody. Another reform suggested is the elimination of T and U visas. Essentially, a U visa provides legal status to victims of a list of qualifying criminal activities who have suffered substantial physical or mental abuse and possess information that may be helpful to law enforcement. T visas are for victims of human trafficking who assist authorities in the investigation or prosecution of trafficking crimes. It states that the S visa is already available and should be used, which is essentially legal status for informants and has a broader definition and scope for those eligible. The reforms also state that national security should be prioritized in the Student and Exchange Visitor Program, SEVP, and that security risks should be removed from the program. It also states that Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, agents should prioritize smuggling, trafficking, and cross-border crime as their main priority. And finally, the memorandum identifying sensitive zones where ICE are prohibited from operating should be rescinded. The next section is concerning U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. This section is very lengthy and includes a lot of drawn-out language that could very easily have been more logically summarized. It basically says reforms needed are to help prevent fraud within the asylum program and the reversal of the policy of removing legal barriers to immigration, such as public benefits. It states this policy is not only a violation of statute, but also provides a magnet for further illegal immigration. The new policies proposed for USCIS is to focus more on fraud detection and eligibility determination rather than speed and processing. It would also shift USCIS to a vetting agency as it was intended and increase scrutiny on who is granted visas based on a merit-based system instead of randomized as it is currently. The chapter also details border and immigration statutory, regulatory, and administrative changes. These are a set of changes that are proposed that apply more broadly to the border and immigration issue. These include legislative and regulatory changes. Essentially, it asks for appropriation from Congress for border wall and port of entry infrastructure, reforms to legislation dealing with unaccompanied minors that would discourage and deter parents from sending their children to the border unaccompanied, and return unaccompanied minors to their country of origin in a safe and efficient manner. It also requests asylum reform, making the determination for asylum requests more stringent and less broad in terms of who is eligible. It basically raises the standard for fear of persecution and eliminates gang and domestic violence from consideration of those seeking asylum. It also asks Congress to make E-Verify mandatory. With regard to state and local law enforcement, it asks for congressional authorization for state and local law enforcement to participate in immigration and border security actions in accordance with Arizona v. United States and requires compliance with immigration detainers consistent with the 10th Amendment. It also calls for reform to the H-1B visa program so that U.S. workers are not disadvantaged by that program. The next section details Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. With regard to FEMA, there's a lot of criticism towards the 1988 Stafford Act, wherein the authors state that since the passing of the act, many disaster costs were shifted from state and local government to the federal government, and that has created a strain on funding and logistics responsibility of the agency. It asks to raise the threshold for funding to better keep pace with inflation. It also recommends applying a deductible system to better incentivize states to avoid seeking federal funds unless absolutely necessary. This section also points out issues with the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, in that it states that the NFIP is essentially a subsidized flood insurance provided at prices lower than the actuarially fair rate, and that when flood costs exceed NFIP revenue, FEMA seeks taxpayer-funded bailouts. It cites current, or at least as of the writing of this chapter, NFIP debt as being $20.5 billion, and states that Congress canceled $16 billion in debt in 2017 when FEMA reached its borrowing authority limit. The subsidization and bailouts have only encouraged more development in flood zones, presenting an increase in the potential loss to both NFIP and the taxpayer. The suggestion is that NFIP be phased out and replaced with private insurance. Further recommendations for FEMA include the reduction of FEMA and DHS grants, which have led to waste, fraud, and abuse by local governments and have not incentivized state and local preparedness. Finally, the chapter closes with the United States Coast Guard, USCG. The reforms and policies detailed under the U.S. Coast Guard essentially calls for a realignment of the Coast Guard mission in protecting the homeland around the exclusive economic zone, which is the area out to 200 miles from shore. Not much else beyond bringing it in line with what it says is modernization of the fleet, such as that of the Navy, is really needed, and nothing else really substantial is detailed under the U.S. Coast Guard section. Next is Chapter 6, Department of State. This section of the document goes into great detail on what exactly should be the mission and stated goals of the Department of State. It calls for some broad reforms to the department, and that it calls for a freeze on all efforts to implement unratified treaties and international agreements, and the prioritization of U.S. citizens in state operations. It calls for the State Department to respond vigorously to the Chinese threat, and to align diplomatic efforts accordingly as if China is a hostile actor. It also calls for visa reciprocity in nations that the U.S. allows visas but are not reciprocated, and states that will cease until that reciprocal relationship is brought back in line. It further states that any nation who refuse citizens that have been ordered removed from the U.S. be subject to harsh penalties, such as the risk of a suspension of issuance of all immigrant visas, non-immigrant visas, or all visas entirely. With regard to foreign relations, from the State Department stance, it calls for an increased external pressure towards China, and has a very lengthy emphasis on the issues relating to diplomatic relations with China over the past several years. With regard to Iran, the chapter calls for a move away from a policy of previous administrations and a focus on fostering a more positive relationship with the Iranian people if they seek freedom from their current regime. Next, it discusses Russia, and the section on Russia recognizes the divide among conservatives on how best to handle Russia and the Russo-Ukrainian war. The three sides it details are the support of Ukraine and putting an end to the conflict with pre-invasion borders, the negotiation for an end to the war with a negotiated settlement, and then the isolationist approach where the U.S. ceases to provide further aid. It provides no guidance for how the incoming administration would approach this. With regard to the final specific foreign matter, North Korea, this section simply states that the State Department should maintain a firm stance against North Korea and not allow them to continue to pose a threat to international interests. It doesn't detail exactly how to accomplish this. The section concerning the Western Hemisphere, to put it succinctly, is to increase trade and energy production more locally within the Western Hemisphere. It also calls upon the next administration to promote the sovereignty of Mexico as it works to help the government reject the narco control of the nation. It calls for the U.S. to lead in the diplomatic effort to help lead South American neighbors to move away from foreign influence and collaborate more with hemispherical allies. With the Middle East and North Africa, the author stresses that the U.S. work to prevent the Iranian nuclear program from continuing, as well as building on the Abraham Accords and fostering diplomacy with Arab states like Saudi Arabia. It also suggests the U.S. form a Middle East security pact to include Israel, Egypt, and the Gulf states, as well as potentially India, and work to maintain and protect the freedom of movement throughout the Red Sea and Suez Canal, citing its importance to international trade. Sub-Saharan Africa, in summary, is cited as having a need to move away from standalone humanitarian development and facilitating growth in African countries instead of what it essentially states has been a failure with development aid not going to intended purposes due to corruption and conflict. It also calls for opposition to Chinese activity in Africa and to counter the furtherance of terrorism on the continent. Finally, it calls for more diplomatic activities with regard to Africa, and not what it claims as ill-received social issues and initiatives being promoted and imposed upon African nations. The author details the complexity of dealing with post-Brexit Europe and stresses the need to foster continued relations with both the UK and our EU partners. With Asia, it stresses the maintenance of trade with Asian partners, but highlights some key details with regard to Afghanistan and Pakistan relations, and that it calls for strengthening ties with India while acknowledging the control of Afghanistan being returned to the Taliban and the military political rule in Pakistan making expectations of normal relations low, if not impossible. Finally, the section regarding the Arctic details how, because of Alaska, the U.S. is an Arctic nation, and thus should lead the effort in opposing China's incursion into the Arctic region to form what it refers to as a Polar Silk Road. The section relating to international organizations details how the U.S. should maintain our partnership with the UN while working to view them as a means to attain goals and not an end. It also calls for a more arm's-length approach to the WHO in light of what it states as failures of that organization to have consideration for U.S. interests during the COVID-19 pandemic. The reenactment of funding limitations and termination to many organizations from the Trump administration that were reversed under Biden is called for in this section and would see that money better spent on U.S. interests instead of internationally. It calls for the ceasing of funding of abortion and international organizations specifically, and also states that instances like the COVID-19 pandemic need not impede upon the rights of the people. Next, Chapter 7, the Intelligence Community. This chapter begins with the CIA. Essentially, the section relating to the CIA calls for the reduction in bureaucracy and the restructuring of mid-level managers to better have accountability and return the agency to focus on their stated mission goals. Much like the military, the authors call for a rejection of social engineering and partisanship within the CIA and state that the culture shift towards a more OSS-like culture like that of the early CIA, where the agency focuses on intelligence and threat assessment. With regard to covert action, the author suggests that the president have a complete review of current and proposed covert actions immediately after inauguration and evaluate their effectiveness and need. It stresses keeping covert military action and covert central intelligence action separate and in line with each branch's stated goals. This next section, Preventing the Abuse of Intelligence for Partisan Purposes, is a special section outlined where it calls for the prevention of abuse of intelligence for partisan purposes. It makes note of intelligence assets being used inappropriately, such as to pursue claims of the Trump-Russia collusion, as well as the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop investigation. It claims these issues did not arise from the executive branch, but instead from partisanship within the intelligence community. It calls for political neutrality within the intelligence community and a more transparent approach with regard to intelligence leadership and congressional oversight. It stresses working to return the intelligence community to a more faithful stance towards the oath to the Constitution and restoring faith in the community not only with Congress, but also with the American people. Next, it deals with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. This next section concerning FISA outlines that it has been abused in the past, noting the Carter Page incident where information from the FBI and DOJ was concealed and applications were filled with errors. It suggests the incoming administration consider reforms to help prevent abuses of national security authority. It highlights provisions which might include stiffer penalties and mandatory investigations when intelligence leaks are aimed at domestic political targets, tighter controls on otherwise lawful intercepts that also collect the communications of domestic political figures, an express prohibition on politically motivated use of intelligence authorities, and reforms to improve accountability of the Department of Justice and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. There's also a section detailing the implementation of intelligence community assets and focusing on China, as well as National Counterintelligence and Security Center, NCSC, keeping their assets focused on peer-related threats. Once again, a focus on China here, but nothing beyond stating that they pose a threat and caution be exercised in dealing with China. The rest of the chapter outlines how the intelligence community should stay focused on analyzing and investigating threats posed to the U.S., and essentially calls for the utilization of intelligence assets and maintaining a high standard of national security. Chapter 8 is concerning media agencies. With regard to the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM, the mission statement they have essentially details everything about their policies for this agency. It details what it is intended for, where it has fallen short, and what reforms aim to accomplish. Broadly, the author suggests moving away from partisan bias in global media efforts and present American policy for global dissemination. It calls for a reduction in budget for the agency and states their current operations can be conducted on less than $700 million per year. It aims to accomplish this by reduction in spending on what it refers to as pet projects, eliminating redundancy, and reducing unnecessary hiring. The next section is talking about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or CPB. It closes with details on CPB, and it details how every Republican president since Nixon has tried to strip the CPB of taxpayer funding. Nixon was the first president in office when the National Public Radio, NPR, and the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, went on air, which are both funded by the CPB. In essence, it states that all Republican presidents for the last 50 years have recognized that public funding of domestic broadcasts is a mistake. Even Antonin Scalia warned that there was a, quote, long-range problem of significant social consequences, that is, the development of a government-funded broadcast system similar to the BBC, end quote. The chapter continues with pointing out the deeply rooted bias within the public broadcasting entities, as it cites Pew Research study done in 2014 that shows PBS's audience as 60% liberal to 15% conservative, and NPR as 67% liberal to 12% conservative. It outlines that this has led to extreme partisanship from what is intended to be taxpayer-subsidized broadcasters that fail to meet the standard of objectivity that they should. The solution, the author points out, would be logistically easy, and states that CBP gets advanced appropriation, which means it's funded 2 years in advance to insulate the agency from congressional funding and oversight. For fiscal year 2023, CBP requested $565 million in advanced appropriation, an increase of $40 million from fiscal year 2022. It claims that this unjustified budgetary treatment should be ended. Of course, the author then recognizes that without this taxpayer funding, NPR and PBS would likely have to file for bankruptcy. However, it points out that the membership model that CPB uses, as well as funding from corporations and foundations, would allow these broadcasters to continue to operate. It cites George Will and his stating that if Sesame Street programming were put up for auction, it would have plenty of potential bidders, and notes that Sesame Street is now on HBO and is capable of being profitable. The author goes on to state that these entities would then be stripped of the presumption that they act in the public interest, and states that they have not done so in quite some time. It says that they have zero claim to the original intended purpose of being non-commercial educational stations, or NCE stations. This comes with benefits such as reserved band frequency at the lower end of the FM band, and that they are exempt from licensing fees to the FCC. It further makes claim that they are not non-commercial as they run ads and have ceased to be non-commercial, and that they are in fact non-educational as well. It closes by stating that the next administration should ask the FCC to exclude PBS and NPR from the NCE denomination and all privileges that come with it. Next, Chapter 9, U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. This chapter begins by outlining the mission and origin of USAID. It states that it helps communities to lead their own development journeys by reducing the impact of conflict, preventing hunger and the spread of disease, and counteracting the drivers of violence, instability, transnational crime, and other threats. It states that through these efforts, it helps to prevent other nations from being likely to act against American interests abroad. It goes into the history of the organization at its founding under John F. Kennedy as a way to help stop the spread of communism and to assist people in the world to transition away from socialism and be more likely to embrace free market democratic systems. Today, USAID is the government's leader in global development and humanitarian disaster assistance response. What the author calls for in adjusting USAID and its mission is to align foreign aid with our foreign policy. Again, China is mentioned and says that USAID should also counter the foreign economic development being conducted by China and their debt traps, where they leverage these transactions against those they claim to help. The recommendations with regard to USAID also include scaling back President Biden's executive orders that put the climate crisis at the center of U.S. foreign policy and national security, and to draw back on the idea that our policy should be to mitigate the devastating inequalities that intersect with gender, race, ethnicity, and economic security. It says that USAID should no longer consider itself a climate agency, as it did at the start of the Biden administration. It further calls for the ending of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion (DEI) agenda within USAID. It also suggests that USAID should also focus on international religious freedom. The suggestions for priorities of the organization moving forward are to focus on holistic healthcare and support for women, children, and families, increase USAID collaboration with faith-based organizations, strengthening private sector engagement, and holding the UN, WHO, and other multilateral organizations accountable. In summary, the chapter outlines how USAID should be more aligned with U.S. interests and be more closely aligned with our foreign policy, and seek to reduce misuse of foreign aid moving forward. This ends Section 2 of the document. The next section I'll cover in the next video will cover Section 3, which is titled The General Welfare. If you haven't seen the first video, I suggest you go back to watch that to gain a clearer understanding of what is in the Project 2025 document. Stay tuned for the next video, and thanks for watching.